Young and the Restless spoilers. Nick Newman arrived at Chancellor Park Overlook with the kind of controlled tension that only came from years of surviving his own family. A tension sharpened now into something colder, more dangerous, because this time the threat was not a boardroom maneuver or a corporate betrayal, but a human life hanging in limbo. The Overlook itself felt deliberately chosen, not just for privacy but for symbolism, the sheer drop below acting as a silent reminder that power in Genoa City was never abstract. It was always physical, always capable of becoming lethal. Matt Clark was already there, relaxed in a way that felt rehearsed, his posture loose, his gaze roaming the horizon as if he owned the view, as if he owned the situation. From the moment their eyes met, it was clear this was not a negotiation between equals, but a test of nerve. And Matt wasted no time establishing dominance by refusing to offer even the smallest detail about where Sienna was being held. His words were vague by design, hinting that she could be anywhere, moved at a moment's notice, erased if the meeting failed to go his way. And every implication landed like a calculated strike meant to destabilize Nick before the real bargaining began. Nick, however, had anticipated this psychological warfare and met it with a calm that masked the fury burning underneath, reminding Matt that he had followed every instruction precisely. That he had come alone, that no sirens would echo through the park unless Matt chose to provoke them. It was a quiet assertion of control, a way of saying that despite appearances, this was not Matt's game alone. Matt scoffed at the reassurance, unimpressed, eager to strip away the theatrics and get to the point, demanding to know what Nick was actually offering for Sienna's return. Because leverage without profit meant nothing to a man who had already lost everything. Nick did not flinch as he brought Victor into the conversation, pointing out that Matt's financial ruin had not been accidental but engineered. The result of a devastating AI-based attack that had stripped him of resources, credibility, and allies, leaving him exposed in ways he had never imagined possible. Matt bristled at the mention, firing back that Victor's actions had crossed legal lines, that what had been done to him was not just ruthless but criminal. A desperate attempt to reframe himself as a victim rather than the architect of his own downfall. Nick responded with a cold, cutting reminder of Matt's own criminal history, the long list of accusations and whispered truths that followed him like a shadow, making it clear that any courtroom sympathy would be short-lived. Then, without raising his voice, Nick delivered the offer that shifted the entire atmosphere, placing a price on the table that was impossible to ignore. $1 million for Sienna's safe return. Not a negotiation tactic, but a line drawn in blood and money, a declaration that this matter would end one way or another. For a moment, even Matt Clark seemed taken aback, the arrogance faltering just enough to reveal the cracks beneath, and it was in that pause that his true nature surfaced, raw and unfiltered. He admitted, almost with a sense of bitter pride, that he had nothing left, no fortune, no protection, no powerful friends willing to shield him from the consequences of his choices. And that desperation had become his only currency. The confession was not meant to elicit sympathy, but to justify his cruelty, to frame the kidnapping as a logical outcome of a world that had discarded him. His tone shifted into something mocking, venomous, as he taunted Nick with the suggestion that Nick should be grateful, not angry, because Sienna had been the target instead of Noah. That this was a mercy disguised as a crime. The audacity of it was staggering. The implication that Nick should thank the man who had shattered his family's sense of safety. And it ignited something in Nick that no amount of self-control could suppress. The years of restraint, the endless compromises made in the name of stability, collapsed under the weight of that single statement, and Nick moved without thinking. His fist driving into Matt's stomach with a force fueled by terror and rage, followed by a second blow to the face that sent Matt stumbling backward toward the edge of the overlook. In that instant, the conversation ceased to exist, replaced by something primal and irreversible. As Nick grabbed him, his grip iron-tight, the abyss yawning behind Matt like a final warning. Nick's threat was not theatrical, not exaggerated for effect, but spoken with the terrifying clarity of someone who had reached the limit of what he was willing to lose. Promising that if Matt did not reveal where Sienna was, he would not walk away from this cliff, that the hungry darkness below would claim him and erase what little remained of his legacy. The wind howled around them, carrying the weight of every unspoken consequence, and for the first time since this ordeal began, the balance of power shifted, leaving Matt Clark to confront a truth far more frightening than bankruptcy or exposure, that he was standing face to face with a man who had nothing left to negotiate with but his own humanity, and that humanity was slipping away with every passing second. The moment Nick tightened his grip and the abyss loomed behind Matt Clark, the confrontation crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. And Matt understood that survival now depended not on arrogance but on fear sharpened into strategy. He forced himself to smile through the pain, his voice steady enough to carry a final, calculated warning. Killing him would not end this nightmare. It would complete it. Because Sienna's life was bound to his own in ways Nick could not sever with brute force. Matt made it brutally clear that contingency plans existed beyond this overlook, that instructions had already been set in motion, and that his death would be interpreted not as justice, but as a signal, a green light that would ensure Sienna never came home alive. He pressed deeper, knowing exactly where to strike, invoking Noah with deliberate cruelty, painting a future in which Noah's grief would curdle into permanent resentment. A future where Nick would forever be the brother who failed, the man who chose vengeance over rescue. The words were poison, but they were effective, forcing Nick to confront the reality that strength alone could not solve this, that one wrong move would destroy everything he was trying to save. Matt escalated further, pushing the threat into grotesque territory by suggesting he could simply jump, let gravity do the work, and leave behind a story that would frame Nick as a murderer, dragging him into legal chaos while Sienna paid the ultimate price elsewhere. It was blackmail stripped to its ugliest form, a final attempt to reclaim control by weaponizing Nick's conscience and his past. Nick's response was chilling in its calm. He told Matt to go ahead, to jump if he wanted, because he had walked away from accusations before and would do it again. A reminder that the Newman name, for better or worse, had survived storms far worse than one desperate man's last lie. The standoff stretched, every second thick with consequence, until Matt finally cracked, the bravado draining away as he recognized that Nick was not bluffing but calculating, weighing outcomes with ruthless clarity. With no leverage left except the promise of money, Matt agreed to the terms, accepting the $1 million in exchange for Sienna's safe return, stipulating only that the account details would be delivered once he was safely out of the country, far beyond the reach of Newman influence. Nick released him, but not before delivering a warning that carried the full weight of his fury, a vow that if Matt ever came near his family again, there would be no negotiations, no deals, and no second chances, only consequences. Matt retreated from the overlook shaken and diminished, leaving Nick alone with the cold wind and the knowledge that this battle was not over, only paused. Its resolution dependent on a man he would never trust. Elsewhere in Genoa City, Phyllis was unraveling in a very different way, her day collapsing under the weight of betrayal dressed up as professionalism. The news from Billy hit her like a calculated insult, the abbot's decision to put her proposal on hold feeling less like a strategic pause and more like a quiet dismissal. And she reacted the only way she knew how, by refusing to accept it from a distance. She stormed the Abbott mansion fueled by indignation and wounded pride, determined to confront Jack face to face and force clarity out of a situation that had suddenly become opaque. Her declaration that she would return the company to him was not an act of generosity but a challenge, an attempt to regain control by exposing the power imbalance she felt tightening around her. Jack's refusal to reconsider, his insistence that the deal was canceled and final, stripped the gesture of its impact, leaving Phyllis standing in a room that suddenly felt hostile, every polished surface reflecting her loss of leverage. She argued that Jabot was faltering, that the numbers told a story Jack was choosing to ignore, and that walking away from the negotiation was not strength but denial, yet Jack remained unmoved, his resolve hardening with every word she threw at him. When Phyllis refused to leave, planting herself on the sofa as if physical presence could force emotional accountability, the confrontation shifted from business to something far more personal. Jack claimed he owed her nothing. No explanations, no justifications. But Phyllis refused to accept that dismissal, insisting that she deserved the truth because this was not just a deal falling apart but a relationship ending without warning. The accusation that Jack had used Billy as a proxy to do his dirty work cut deep, exposing the resentment she felt at being managed, sidelined, and handled indirectly. And Jack's response only widened the wound when he dismissed her hacking skills as unnecessary, a blunt declaration that the very thing that had made her indispensable was now expendable. Their exchange ended with hollow pleasantries, a bitter wish for a happy new year that underscored how completely things had fractured, and Phyllis left in a storm of anger and humiliation, the door closing behind her like punctuation on a chapter she had not agreed to end. In the aftermath, Billy arrives to find Jack alone with the consequences of his decision, and in a rare moment of honesty, he admitted that he still believed Phyllis had been their best option, that her instincts and willingness to push boundaries were assets they might soon regret discarding. Jack listened but did not relent, sensing that Billy's restless intellect was already chasing something else. A more elaborate vision for the future of artificial intelligence that did not include Phyllis and might not even align with Jabo as it currently existed. The tension between them lingered unspoken, a sign that while one conflict had ended, another was quietly taking shape, driven by ambition, mistrust, and the dangerous allure of technology that promised power at a cost no one had fully calculated yet. At the remote motel tucked far from the roads most people remembered existed, Matt Clark stood over Sienna's motionless body and allowed himself a moment of stillness that felt almost reverent in its cruelty. The room smelled of stale air and disinfectant, the kind of place where time slowed and consequences felt distant, and Sienna lay unconscious on the bed, her breathing shallow but steady. Proof of life reduced to the most basic biological rhythm. Matt watched her chest rise and fall as if weighing something far heavier than a ransom, his expression unreadable, his thoughts spiraling in directions that no longer obeyed logic or restraint. Annie hovered nearby, uneasy, her instincts screaming that whatever came next would not be bound by the agreement Matt had just secured. When she finally asked how the meeting with Nick Newman had gone, Matt answered with unsettling confidence, saying everything had unfolded exactly as he had anticipated. Every reaction, every threat, every concession falling neatly into place. Yet the calm in his voice only made the truth more horrifying, because beneath it lay a confession that stripped the deal of all meaning. He had not decided whether Sienna would ever be returned at all. The money, the threats, the promises were no longer the point, merely tools he had used to regain a sense of relevance after losing everything else. What truly consumed him now was a darker, more twisted question that clawed at his thoughts, one that no negotiation could resolve. Whether Noah Newman should be allowed to live, whether sparing him would be an act of mercy or a mistake that left the story unfinished. This was no longer about leverage or survival, but about control in its purest, most unhinged form. A man stripped of power trying to reclaim it by deciding who deserved to exist. Annie could see it in his eyes, the flicker of something unmoored, the kind of madness that no amount of money could satisfy. And in that moment it became terrifyingly clear that Matt Clark was no longer operating within the boundaries of reason or self-preservation. Only impulse and obsession. Miles away, unaware of the full depth of that danger, Nick Newman returned to Sharon's house carrying the weight of a victory that felt fragile and incomplete. He delivered the update with careful restraint, telling them that the exchange had been set in motion, that the terms were agreed upon, and that the only concrete confirmation he had been given was that Sienna was still alive. The words should have brought relief, but instead they landed like a fragile promise, one that could shatter without warning. Noah's reaction was immediate and visceral, fear tightening around him as the reality of his sister's continued captivity refused to loosen its grip. To Noah, the absence of certainty was unbearable, the idea that Sienna's life depended on the whims of a man like Matt Clark sending him into a spiral of helplessness and dread. Nick saw it in his son's face, the same desperation he himself had felt standing at the edge of the overlook, and it tore at him in ways he could not articulate. He urged Noah to hold on, to let the process unfold, to trust that pushing too hard or acting too fast could destroy what little leverage they had left. It was not reassurance so much as a plea, a father asking his son to accept uncertainty because the alternative was chaos. Yet even as Nick spoke, a part of him understood how hollow those words sounded, because he sensed that something was wrong, that the agreement he had wrestled from Matt Clark rested on unstable ground. In the quiet that followed, the house seemed to hold its breath, each of them trapped in their own private fear, bound together by hope that felt increasingly fragile. Somewhere beyond their reach, a man with nothing left to lose stood over Sienna's unconscious form, contemplating not just how this story would end, but who would be allowed to survive it. And that knowledge, though unspoken, hung over them like a shadow waiting to fall.